everybody, and welcome back to another evening of the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and in tonight's session we are deep diving into the turn of the second millennium, the beginning of the 1000s, and what that meant for the Jewish world. So come on, let's jump right in and learn a little Jewish history together. So the first idea we need to discuss is what this time period is called from a Jewish perspective. So we've talked about since the beginning of this session that our rabbinic leadership, our Torah scholarship, always has a name. We have different qualifications of time periods throughout from Mount Sinai until modern times. First, we of course had Moshe Rabbeinu. Then we had the Zakanim, the elders that followed him. Then we had the Nevi'im, the prophets, and that gave way eventually. After the prophecy came to an end, we had the Anshe Knesset Gedola, and then we really segued into the time period of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah. Then we went from there to the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara. The next step was the Savaraim, the rabbis who edited the Gemara and made it a little bit more usable for the public, like myself and you. And the next topic, the next group of classification rabbis we had was the Gaonim, which we discussed last week, that the time period of the Gaonim essentially comes to an end when the supremacy of Babylon, of Bavel, diminishes and the Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities start to take off on their own. Now, if the time period of the Gaonim came to an end, that means we have a new time period of rabbis, and that time period is known as the Rishonim. Now, the name Rishonim implies slightly who these rabbis are. Rishonim means the first rabbis. Now, obviously, these aren't the first rabbis because I've given you a whole list of different groups, different subgroups of rabbis that came before them. But what the Rishonim begins is it's the beginning of the time period of rabbis who were writing commentary and writing glosses and codifying the Talmud. So the last few groups of rabbis we had, the Tanaim were the Mishnah, the Amoraim were the Gemara, the Savaraim and the Gaonim essentially give form to the Talmud. Now we have rabbis who are writing commentary on the Talmud and who are codifying the Talmud. And those rabbis are called the Rishonim, the first rabbis, meaning the early commentators. And this time period of the Rishonim goes essentially from the year 1000 to the year 1500. This 500-year segment is what we call the Rishonim, and it is those rabbis who really make the Talmud usable for all of us. Those rabbis who bring the Chumash to life for us. And these are rabbis who go by the name of Rashi, Rambam, Ramban. Those are the three most famous, and many, many others, the Ritva, the Rashba, Rabbeinu Hananel, etc., etc. But the three most famous that we'll really dive into are Rashi, Rambam, and the Ramban. And we'll mention many of the others who are also very, very significant, but this is the time period known as the Rishonim. Now, quite often you will hear them referred to as the medieval commentators or the medieval Talmudic and biblical commentators because this is the medieval times, and these are the rabbis of the times, but we refer to them as the Rishonim. And they are the rabbis who really bring the Talmud to life for us in one sense, and also will take steps to codify the Talmud on the other hand. Because as we've mentioned before, the Talmud in of itself is not a book that we can open up and look into and find exactly what to do as a Jew. For example, if a Jew, let's say, wakes up late in the morning and wants to know if it's too late to say the Shema or too late to pray the Amidah, it's very hard to open the Talmud and get the answer to that question. But we're going to see that a lot of the works and the progress of the Rishonim is to bring us to the codification that will become what we know as the Shulchan Aruch, which will be published in that cusp between the Rishonim and the next category of rabbis, the Achronim, because the Shulchan Aruch is going to be published roughly in the year 1500, so it's going to be the bridge between this time period we are in now and the next time period of rabbis. But it is the works and the efforts of the rabbis in this time period that are going to build up and become what we know as the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law as we know it today and as it stands unto this very day. So that's the time period we're in now. We're in the time period of the Rishonim. Okay, I want to say a little bit more about the Jews of Spain. We mentioned last week how when the Muslim group of the Moors come to Spain, the Jews always fared very well under the Moors, and that's going to begin what we know as the Golden Age of Spain. And we're going to see during this time period that the Jews reach the highest of heights in Spanish civilization under the leadership of the Moors. We're going to see that Jews reach high levels in the army. There's going to be very famous rabbis and very famous Jews who are top positions, who hold top positions in the Spanish army. We're going to see Jews who have high government positions. But there's going to be, as often happens, there's going to be a negative result of all this positivity. Because while we're going to see the Jews reach the highest levels of military and government and affluence and success, what often happens is that comes hand in hand with that is there is assimilation. And that is definitely the case that we see with the Jews in Spain, with the Sephardic Jewish community. Now it's interesting. I believe we mentioned before that when we look at the story of the Jews in Egypt, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky points out that that is in fact the blueprint for every step in our exile. Because what happened when the Jews got to Egypt? They were the top of the top. We had Joseph, who was the viceroy of the country, the highest level of government, the highest level of prosperity. He set his brothers up to be in the same socioeconomic class that he was in. And the Jews truly thrived in the first few generations they were in Egypt. But eventually what happens is they become a little bit too affluent, a little bit too successful. They forget their connection to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They assimilate. They start walking sideways and writing in hieroglyphics and change their name from Tatuski down to Tut, and before you know it, they're more Egyptian than they are Jewish, and the next thing we see happens is the real affliction. The slavery comes about in Egypt, and the persecution of the Jews in Egypt happens. And unfortunately, that's the blueprint we've seen play out time and time again, every stop in our exile, and that is very much the case in Spain. Because during these years, the beginning of the second millennium, we're going to see the Jews reaching the highest of heights and still maintaining their Jewish connection, but we're going to see that will start to dwindle as we get to the second century, the third century, the fourth century of the second millennium. And eventually we know that this is going to end with the Jews being kicked out of Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, then the Spanish expulsion, and it's going to come to a very enigmatic ending for the Jews of Spain. And it really starts with, unfortunately, the assimilation that comes hand in hand with the affluence, and that is really case in point with every step of the Jews in exile. Now, one other interesting negative result of the Jews' success in Spain is that the structure quite often of Muslim communities are often very clan-based. In other words, even though you have a big country like Spain, you have many different smaller clans within that country. And that is usually the case virtually anywhere in the Muslim world. So what happens is the Jews have essentially hitched their wagons to the Muslims, to the Moors at this time, those different clans and tribal stripes that'll go on in the Muslim world, and many ways that will boil over to the Jewish world. Because if you have Jews that are associated and work with and affiliated with this particular clan, and you have Jews who are associated with another clan, and those clans have strife one unto the other, that will overflow when they're in shul, and this guy gets shlishi and that guy gets revi and he's upset and whatever it is. But we're going to see that different clan division within the Muslim world, because of the Jews' close connection to the Muslims in Spain, it'll spill over in many ways to the Jewish world. Okay, I want to touch on some of the famous names. We'll get into the really big names in the next few sessions. Like I said, we're going to spend a lot of time discussing Rashi, a lot of time discussing the Rambam, a lot of time discussing the Ramban, as probably three of the biggest of the Rishonim. But I want to at least mention some of the important names that will that come up during this time period, during the early time period of the Rishonim, and these are specifically the Spanish Rishonim, the Spanish medieval commentators, or medieval rabbis or medieval personalities. So one of the first affluent, successful Jews in Spain, at least whose name we have and who's recorded as such, is somebody by the name of Khazars ibn Shaprut. So Khazars ibn Shaprut was, on one sense, a tremendous Torah scholar, But he was also a very successful person in the Spanish society. And we're going to see that he reaches the highest of heights within Spanish government. He might have been prime minister. He might have been another minister. But he was definitely up there in the government in the 10th century, roughly in the year 970, somewhere around there. And what's interesting is not only do we have a lot of his writings, we have him quoted quite often in Jewish works. We know that he reached the high levels of Spanish society. But we mentioned, I believe, 2 sessions ago, the Khazars, the kingdom of the Khazars that had converted to Judaism. And it's interesting that a lot of what we know about the Khazars is actually through Chasdei ibn Shaprut, because there were correspondences that went back and forth between the king of the Khazars and Chasdei ibn Shaprut. There were letters back and forth, and we actually have those letters. We have those letters both quoted. We don't have them firsthand, but we definitely have them secondhand, quoted by people within a generation of when they were written. And a lot of what we discussed just a few weeks ago about the kingdom of the Khazars, really comes to us from Chasdei ibn Shaprut. So it's safe to say he was really the first famous Sephardic rabbi, first famous Sephardic government official that really made it in Spain. And one of the other ones who was very famous from this time period is someone by the name of Shmuel HaNagid. Now, if you're familiar with the streets of Yerushalayim, as Rabbi Beryl Wine always says, you can learn a lot of Jewish history just by looking at the names of the streets of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem. And you go to the neighborhood of Rechavia, there's actually a street name for Shmuel HaNagid. So Shmuel HaNagid was basically 100 years after Chasdei ibn Shaprut, and he was the prime minister of Spain. So we know for a fact that he was quite possibly the first Jewish prime minister, maybe the only Jewish prime minister of Spain. And again, it's just remarkable in this time that we've had definitely other times in world history where we've talked about Jews who've reached the level of vice president or viceroy or vice prime minister. That's what Joseph was. That's what Mordechai was. We've had Jews reach that level of viceroy, of vice president, but we know that Shmuel HaNagid was actually the prime minister. Now, again, it was a monarchy with a Muslim king. So as these constitutional monarchies, if you will, often go, you have the king who's the king, and you have the prime ministers running the government, and that's who Shmuel HaNagid was. Another famous rabbi from this time period is Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel's commentary is actually written on many pages of the Vilna Talmud that we use today, the edition of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud that we use today. That's a commentary that's right there on the page. And he was another very famous rabbi from this time. Commentary is right there on the page of the Talmud, which just shows his fame and his supremacy and importance in Judaism. Now, in the 12th century, there's a very famous rabbi by the name of Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, who had a yeshiva, and he is known to us as the Rif. Now, the Rif is significant because he is the first rabbi we have that took active steps to codify Jewish law. Now, what did he do? He wrote a commentary that is found in the back of most editions of the Talmud, and what he essentially does is he takes the words of the Talmud, and the Talmud always has a lot of back and forth, comparing different texts, trying to get to the what the halacha is, what the right answer is. What Rav Yitzchak Alfasi does is he essentially eliminates all the back and forth, and he writes a commentary that's just the bottom line. Just the halachic bottom line as to what to do as a Jew. And that's in the back of virtually every edition of the Talmud. So when you're studying the Talmud, if you get to the end of a topic and you want to know, okay, I'm still a little confused. What's the halacha over here? What are you supposed to do? You can flip to the back and look at the Rif and see how he really summarizes the whole thing, gets rid of all the back and forth, and tells you what the bottom line of each topic and the Talmud is. Now, his significance goes a step further, is that when we get to the aforementioned Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law unto this very day, the Code of Jewish Law is, the Shulchan Aruch is written by Rav Yosef Cairo. And the way that Rav Yosef Cairo decided what to codify into Jewish law is he essentially made for himself a virtual Jewish court, and he took the positions of 3 rabbis. And the 3 rabbis were the Rambam, who we talked about before, is one of the most famous, the Rif, who we just mentioned, and a rabbi that we'll get to probably next week, maybe the week after, by the name of Rabbeinu Usher, the Rush. And anytime there was a dispute between the conclusions, the halachic conclusions that these three rabbis came to in their writings, the Rav Yosef Karo looked at it as if it was a virtual Jewish court, a virtual Beis Din, and in a Beis Din and Jewish court, majority rules, majority opinion rules, 2 out of 3 will always take the cake. So therefore, that's how Rav Yosef Karo decides what to write in the Shulchan Aruch. And the first such historical personality who has a seat in that virtual court is the Rif, Rabbeinu Alfasi, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, and next will be the Rambam, and then the Rush. And those are the 3 pillars of what become the Shulchan Aruch. Another famous rabbi from this time period is Rav Yehuda Halevi. Now, Rav Yehuda Halevi is probably most famous for the work of the Kuzari that we mentioned before. The Kuzari is a philosophical work that is written to be the hypothetical process that the kingdom of the Khazars went through when they converted to Judaism. In other words, the philosophical questions they debated and thought about and discussed. And the way the book is written is the king of the Khazars wants to adopt a monotheistic religion, and he calls a leader of the 3 major monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and they have a little virtual debate with him, or not a virtual debate with him, but a little bit of make a presentation to him, and in the book, Judaism obviously wins, and they convert to Judaism, but a lot of the philosophies of Judaism are discussed there, and in truth, a lot of the philosophies that are written in that book are used unto this very day when we have situations when we're trying to really explain to someone how Judaism is the right and proper way to live one's life. So a lot of the arguments and the philosophies and the philosophic ideas that he puts forward in that book are still used unto this very day. Another famous Sephardic rabbi from this time period is Rav Avram ibn Ezra, who's quite often just called the Ibn Ezra. And he wrote he was a very prolific writer, wrote a commentary on the prophets and the writings. He wrote a lot of poems, wrote a lot of piyuts, a lot of the different poetry that we say throughout the Jewish year. And he's quite often called Ibn Ezra. I think we mentioned before that in Arabic, Ibn is the same thing as Ben in Hebrew. So his Hebrew name would be Avram ben Ezra, but we call him Avram ibn Ezra because that's what they called him. Again, a very prolific writer whose name we see come up a lot from this time period. Okay, so that's just a taste of some of the Sephardic personalities that we see in the first few centuries of the golden age of Spain, as the Jews are really enjoying tremendous prosperity, much in contrast to what is going on in the Ashkenazi world. So what is going on in the Ashkenazi world at this time? One of the main things that affects the Ashkenazi world at this time is the First Crusade. So what is the First Crusade? What is the Crusades in general? So there's a couple of different cultural things that were going on in France. Mainly, we're going to see certain crusades come out of England, but the initial crusades come out of France. So there's a lot of the culture of France at that time that paves the way for the crusade. And one of the main backdrops is the whole culture of knights and squires and whatnot that for many people is often glorified in either books or in movies. We think of knights as chivalrous and their armor and everything, and the battles and their squires and their pages and all the different the different hierarchy and of that system, and the knights of the Round Table and King Arthur and Sir Lancelot and all these different things. And we think of it in somewhat glorious terms if we just think about it from a literature perspective or a Hollywood perspective. But in truth, that is not an accurate representation as to what this we'll call it the knight culture was. The knights of yore were not someone being knighted in the United Kingdom today. It was quite different. The best comparison in a modern sense is basically organized crime. Right? That's really what the whole knight culture was. And you had these knights who were really to hire for different jobs, to be able to go in and get certain wealth. And each of the knights did have this whole entourage that went along with them, with the squires and everything. And it ended up to become quite disruptive throughout Europe, throughout France, throughout Italy, throughout England. The whole night culture became quite disruptive at the time when it was taking place. So that's an important backdrop for the Crusades, because in all honesty, one of the main motivations of the Crusades was to find something to get these guys out of Europe, because they were causing so much trouble in Europe that this was a great way to give them a cause, get them out of Europe, and take care of the problems that they often cause within the countries at hand. Now, there was another concept that really, that convinced the knights to be involved with such a thing, and that is that one of the big ideas in the church at this time is that you had many different ways to find your place in heaven. And one of the ways that you could find your place in heaven was to essentially you could be a pious person. That was probably ideal. We're going to see there's a concept of indulgences. You could buy your way into heaven, or you could go on a crusade. Right? The Pope and the Church, they came up with this idea on if you go on a crusade and you would fight a holy war, then even you could be the worst riffraff, knight, organized crime personality in the world, but if you would fight a crusade, then you would secure your place in heaven. So really we have to understand the Crusades coming with the backdrop of what we'll call the night problem, K-N-I-G-H-T, the night problem that went on in Europe, and that was a lot of what led to the Crusades. But there were other religious ideas that came to lead to the Crusades as well. The Pope at this time is Pope Urban II. And if you recall from previous sessions, we talked about how the church had been split into two down the lines of which was originally the Roman Empire split into two, and that became the church split into two. We had the Catholic Church based in Rome, and we had the Eastern Orthodox Church based in whatever name we're up to now. I guess we're just about up to Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium, whatever it was called at whatever time. So you basically have the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And even though the church had been separated now for several hundred years, it was always a thorn in the side of the different popes of the Western Church and the leaders of the Eastern Church. They wanted, they didn't like the fact, it didn't look good for their religion that the church was split into two. So at that time, the Eastern Church found itself in a particularly weak place, and Pope Urban II saw that he might have an opportunity to gain the upper hand over the Eastern Church, and therefore reuniting the churches back into one, making it one Catholic Church, of course under his leadership. And therefore a big motivation of the Crusades was to go to Istanbul, Turkey, Constantinople, Byzantium, whatever you want to call it, and essentially overthrow the Eastern Orthodox Church and bring them back into the influence of the Western Church, of the Catholic Church. So that was another motivation of the Crusades at this time, to be able to show the supremacy of the Catholic Church and to gain supremacy over the Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, whatever you want to call it. Now, there were a couple other issues that played in as well. At this time, the Muslims were in control of Jerusalem. They had been since the 7th century, and we're already looking now at the end of the 11th century. So for 4 centuries now, the Muslims had been in control of Jerusalem. And as we mentioned before, there were Christian holy sites in Jerusalem that were essentially identified and built up at the time of Constantine. And therefore, even within Christianity, there was an idea of Christian pilgrims, still really until this very day, but an idea of Christian pilgrims wanting to go to Jerusalem to visit the Christian holy sites. And the Muslims who were in control did not make that very easy. They would block the Christian pilgrims. They wouldn't let them come to Jerusalem. And that didn't sit well with the church. The church, first of all, philosophically, it didn't sit well that there were Muslims in charge of what they held to be a holy city to Christianity. And beyond that, those Muslims who were in charge of the city weren't even letting the Christians come in as pilgrims. So that was another factor that will lead to the Crusades. And the final factor was there was a certain holy man at this time. I say that in quotes, holy man by the name of Peter the Hermit. who had a vision, had a dream, if you will, that Jesus came to him in dream and said that, the Mother Mary came to him in dream and said that Jesus would not come back for his second coming until the Holy Land of Israel was emptied of the infidels that were there. He couldn't come back to earth as long as infidels were in control of Jerusalem, and that also had a major effect on the people. So all of these factors eventually lead to Pope Urban II proclaiming the First Crusade in the year 1096. Now, we always look at the Crusades with the hindsight in time. At the hindsight of time, we're able to say, okay, that's the First Crusade, that's the Second Crusade, that's this, that's that. It wasn't always so organized. It wasn't always quite that organized. But this is at least how we identify it now. So the First Crusade basically broke up into two parts. We had what was called the People's Crusade, which was more the common folk. And then the Prince's Crusade, which was the people who had money and the royalty, and they had more wherewithal to be able to wage such a war. Now, unfortunately for those who participate in the People's Crusade, many of them are not going to survive. But it's going to be the Prince's Crusade who are going to go. They're going to march. They're going to go to Israel. They're going to go to Istanbul and Constantinople, and they are going to rid these places of, in the case of Israel, of the infidels, the Muslim infidels that are there, of the Jews that are there. They're going to try and take control of Constantinople, and that is the Prince's Crusade. Now, what's interesting is there's going to be many crusades. We number 4 or 5 of them, many different crusades. The only one where the Christians are really successful is this First Crusade, and it's the Prince's Crusade. And they're going to go to Israel. They're going to successfully conquer Israel from the Muslims. They're going to kill all the Muslims that are there. They're going to kill all the Jews that are there. And they're going to proclaim the kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting to point out that from the destruction of the Second Temple and in the aftermath of the different Roman wars, there has only been one other power that has actually proclaimed a capital or a kingdom, proclaimed Jerusalem as a capital city of their kingdom, and that is this kingdom of the Crusades, the Crusaders' kingdom. That is it. The Muslims will never make a kingdom with a capital in Jerusalem. No other Christians will, but we'll have the Crusader kingdom, the kingdom of Jerusalem, that will be based in Jerusalem, and that will be the only time we see from the time of the Jews being exiled from Israel until the time we return to Israel, that there was another foreign power that put a capital in Jerusalem. And the Crusades really catch the Muslims by surprise. Remember, the Muslims had a pretty strong winning streak until this point. They were, of course, mentioned before, they were stopped in the 8th century by Charles Martel in France in the Battle of Tours. But they had a lot of wins against the Christians. And now we're going to see really that this is going to be anticipated as maybe the tide starting to turn, and the Muslims are going to be kicked out of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099. And that's a problem in Islam, because we talked about before that in Muslim philosophy, a land that was conquered by the Muslims cannot return to the previous ownership. So we're going to see, obviously, there's going to be a second crusade. The Muslims are going to come back and take it back. But this is a real dent in the armor of the Muslims when the Crusaders come, take over Jerusalem, kick out the Muslims, kick out the Jews, kill the Muslims, kill the Jews, and proclaim the kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, the kingdom of Jerusalem is only going to last for 100 years before the Muslims come back and get the upper hand. But in that 100 years, a lot of damage is going to be done. We're going to see the Muslim holy sites are going to be torn down. Of course, synagogues, whatever were left, are going to be torn down. And it's going to be a Crusader kingdom for roughly 100 years. Now, you might say, okay, this is the Christians waging war against the Muslims. What in the world does this have to do with the Jews? When the Crusaders come back from this First Crusade, those who actually survived the People's Crusade and those who were successful in the Prince's Crusade, they're going to say, we just went all the way to the Holy Land to wage this war against the infidels living in the Holy Land. What about the infidels in our midst? And they're going to come back to Europe, and they're going to see Jews with a certain amount of prosperity, Jews practicing Judaism, and they're going to say, Well, if what's going on in the Holy Land was an offense to our Jesus, then this is also an offense. And why do we have to go all the way to the Holy Land and take care of the infidel? Let's get rid of the infidels in our midst. And we're going to see that the Crusades are going to lead to many pogroms against the Jews in the communities of France, and especially in the Rhineland communities. The Rhineland communities are known to us as the Shum communities, because the three major cities there were Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And if you take the first three letters, you get Shum. And we're going to see that anywhere from 1 to 10,000 Jews are going to be massacred in the aftermath of the Crusades, or during the Crusades, in the Rhineland massacre. That's going to be considered a terrible tragedy in Jewish history. We're going to say a lamentation for that. We do say a lamentation for that on Tisha B'Av. And that's actually one of the reasons why we mourn in the days between Pesach and Shavuos, the days of Sfira, because it was during those days when the massacres at the hands of the Crusaders happened back in the Jewish communities of Europe. So while in many ways the Crusades was a war of the Christians against the Muslims, many Jews are going to be caught up in the wake, and many thousands of Jews are going to be killed, especially in those communities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And really any Jew that comes in the way of the Crusaders, the small Jewish community that was in Israel, is going to be wiped out. And we remember the Crusades as a dark time for the Jews, a time of a lot of Jewish bloodshed, in the name of the Savior of the Jews, in the name of Jesus. Now, it's interesting to point out that when we look at the Crusades, in many ways, the Christians, for the first time, import what the Muslims had done over the previous few centuries. The Muslims, when they come to power, are the first ever to convert by sword. That never existed before. Christians never did that before. But we're going to see that is going to be done at the hands of the Christians, really importing it from the Muslims. And in many ways, the Crusades set the tone of the Christian-Jewish relationship for the next 1,000 years. Because until this point, Christianity had been around for roughly 1,000 years, probably more like 700 years. And it definitely, the relationship between the Jews and the Christian wasn't great, but there weren't these mass pogroms and mass slaughtering of Jews. That we don't see a lot of before this point. But we're going to see that the Crusades in many ways is a watershed moment of anti-Semitism, of European anti-Semitism, that will culminate really in the Holocaust, because that anti-Semitism will continue to build up, and it'll have a lot of spillovers. We'll see. We're going to, of course, when we have the Spanish expulsion, that'll be a certain spillover. We're going to see when we have the Khmelnytsky massacres, the Cossack uprisings, that'll be a spillover. But this Eastern European anti-Semitism, this new virulent form of massacre and pogrom, that will spill over in the form of the Holocaust, when we'll have the German ingenuity meet this European anti-Semitism that starts at this point, and that'll lead to the slaughter of 6 million Jews. So if I was to ask you, what is the watershed moment of the Jewish relationship with the Christians in Europe, it is really this First Crusade that changes the relationship to be a very virulent one with much anti-Semitism and much bloodshed. That unfortunately, that's what we're going to talk about a lot in the coming sessions as we cover this second millennium of modern world history. And I look forward to discussing it together. Don't worry, even though there's a lot of dark moments, there's still a lot of highlights too. And next week, when we come to discuss the personalities of Rashi and Rambam, the next few weeks when we discuss those personalities, those will really be some glorious highlights. And it's really fascinating that those literal heroes of Jewish history were able to do what they did in this very dark time period. Like Rashi, we see, even has interactions with Crusaders, and Rambam, part of his life is running from Crusaders, and yet still they produced everything that they had produced from the Jewish people that really helped to sustain us until this very day. And in the coming sessions, we'll delve more into who they were and what they gave to the Jewish world. And I look forward to discussing it with you, and I wish you all a wonderful week, and look forward to discussing more Jewish history with you next week. Have a great one.